right off the bat, the largest bank in Canada just released their monthly report. I'm doing research on, what are people saying in their outlooks from all these different institutions. The largest bank in Canada just released their monthly forecast update. And their forecasts are explicitly dependent on the outcome of this ruling by the Supreme Court. So this is the largest bank in Canada's monthly forecast update, and they are saying that the number one thing that they are looking for is this risk of U.S. tariffs, and specifically whether or not they will be declared illegal or overturned by the United States Supreme Court once they end their recess. An imminent U.S. Supreme Court ruling on the legal status of IEEPA tariffs remain a key source of volatility to our forecast. As we seek clarity on tariff pass-through, we reduce data visibility to core goods inflation that's still expected to rise in the second quarter. In Canada, we expect fewer implications from the IEEPA ruling, as long as crucial tariff exemptions tied to the CUSMA compliant trade are preserved. So this is the special trade deal Canada, Mexico, and the United States have together. So again, when the largest bank in Canada is telling you to focus on something, you should probably focus on it. And they're saying that this deal with the United States Supreme Court potentially denying Trump his tariffs is the main source of volatility to their forecasts. That's something we got to watch out for. And they can make that decision as soon as February 23rd. Yeah, I personally don't think that the United States Supreme Court is going to overturn Trump's tariffs. I think they would realize that it's going to hurt the United States a lot more if they end up going through with that. Practically speaking, if the Supreme Court upheld Trump's tariffs, then markets would follow current expectations. Everything would just be hunky-dory. And there's nothing ever happens kind of crowd. They would just be very, very happy. Oh, nothing ever happens. Look at this. Everyone's making this big hullabaloo over all this stuff with the tariffs and whatnot. Look at Joe say, oh, da, 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 and look at these big banks going, da, 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 da. Personally, I'd prefer that scenario. It's just like, okay, nothing happens to the tariffs, all well and good. Current expectations continue. But like that bank said, it's kind of the biggest source of potential volatility at the moment. If the Supreme Court does not rule in favor of Trump's tariffs, it will upturn everyone's trading expectations. So many assets will have humongous gaps when they open their price as soon as the news gets released that the tariffs are overturned, and depending on what direction those assets move and by how much, it could cause some serious pain and massive uncertainty for the U.S. economy, even if it's just for a short while. I think it would likely hurt the US dollar in that scenario, especially if there's some kind of demand that the tariffs paid to the United States so far have to be refunded to their respective countries. So far, the Supreme Court has actually ruled in favor of Trump's policies close to 90% of the time. The Supreme Court had 24 rulings, and 88% of the time, the Supreme Court voted in favor of Trump's policies. Just keep that in the back of your head, because we're going to be looking at a few more things here. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a few more things in order to improve our future expectations. There's a site called Metaculus, and we can use that site to check what forecasters are currently expecting from these results. So there's two questions we want to look at. What will the ruling from the Supreme Court be on Trump's tariffs? And two, when will the Supreme Court hand down their ruling? We want to know if they'll do it and when they'll do it. What are the chances? What are the odds? What are the conditions? Because we know the Supreme Court will exit their recess on February 23rd. But that doesn't mean that they make their decision on February 23rd. The Supreme Court has a calendar, and some days are actually more likely to have rulings made and announced and released than others. So we can kind of round down a few days where it's more likely to actually see the decision handed down on. Okay, this is what we want to be looking at. When will the Supreme Court release its decision on presidential tariff authority in learning resources v. Trump? So this is when it will be done. And there are 455 people forecasting this currently. So this is a pretty good sample size. There's about a 20% chance, 20.9% of these 455 forecasters think it's going to happen effectively in the first week. And then 22% think it's going to happen in the first week of March. And then 37% actually think it's going to happen sometime after the middle of March. So it could be another month before we see a ruling. This, in the comments, you can actually read people's analysis. And this is someone who is looking at the Supreme Court's calendar to figure out exactly when there would be an increased likelihood of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Trump's tariff authority. And knowing when the tariff ruling can come in can significantly help us in reducing exposure around potential days when that decision could come out. And if the Supreme Court says the tariffs are illegal or unconstitutional, you can't, Mr. Trump, you can't put on those tariffs, you have to refund everybody, then we want to make sure we can protect ourselves, that we are aware and we have our head on a swivel for potentially these dates. We see that days marked in red are argument days. This is when they argue pending cases and occasionally release decisions around 9:40 to 10 a.m. before they take the bench. So these are the risky days here. Monday through Wednesday, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of March, the 23rd, 24th, 25th, and then the 30th and 31st of March. That's just for the month of March. Green days are conference days. These are days when the court comes behind closed doors and votes in secret. No decisions are released on these days. Blue days are non-argument sessions, also known as opinion days. As we can see, the court is clearly in recess from March 9th to March 13th. They have no argument days scheduled, so they won't be coming out with a decision before they take the bench, and they won't, or they don't, have any opinion days scheduled either. So the soonest we can see a date, a release, is the 23rd, 24th, 25th, and then March 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and then it's kind of 2 weeks break past that. Then it's in the latter half of March. These are the days to watch out for tariff news, and then these are the days to watch out for tariff news sometime in the latter half of the month. Just as a review, it seems like they'll probably shoot for March, either the first week of March, or if it doesn't come by March 3rd, then probably end of March. They'll deliberate, but we just have to be prepared around the dates that these decisions can drop. Here's question number 2. How will the Supreme Court rule on Trump's tariffs? This has way more forecasters. This has 777 people currently forecasting here on this question. 43% of the forecasters say that there's going to be a mixed ruling. 28% of the forecasters, of the 777 forecasters, say that the tariffs will be ruled unlawful. And 18% say that the tariffs will be ruled lawful. There's a whole slew of people in their opinions coming through saying, hey, this is probably going to end up mixed. Nobody necessarily knows what mixed exactly means, and there's not that many comments here that are recent, but there are other places that have similar questions. We can actually load up Kalshi, which has a $5 million volume for their market on this particular question. Currently, odds are essentially 70-30. 30% yes, 70% no. So most Kalshi bettors expect the Supreme Court to rule against Trump's tariffs. Polymarket has a market for this as well, and the odds are pretty much exactly the same, 70-30. One thing to take note of, I looked through the comments for both of these, and then I looked through the top holders here on Polymarket, and it turns out that there's a pretty famous bettor here, I'm Just Ken, who's actually bought Yes shares. This guy's been interviewed on a few news stations about a big bet he won by saying, hey, JD Vance is going to be Trump's vice president. He made a huge bet, and that was his claim to fame. That really got him in front of a lot of media. And look, he was even right on Kevin Warsh. He made $200,000 on saying Kevin Warsh would win. And now we have also their timing. And the timing here on Polymarket doesn't have enough information. The timing market here on Kalshi, it's a bit helpful. Let me just put it this way. There are 3 options here. The odds of seeing the decision before the 1st of March, so in those first 3 possible days, is 40% on Kalshi. There are those 3 days, the 23rd, 24th, and the 25th of February. Those are the days that they can release in the morning a decision on whether or not Trump's tariffs are illegal. And the bettors here in Kalshi are saying, hey, 40% odds of that happening. So here's the 17th. So this is the possibility of seeing the decision just in the beginning of March. This is the odds of seeing the decision just in the end of February when they get off recess. And this is just the probably 82% total odds of seeing it sometime before the end of March. So pretty high odds that are being bet right now on Kalshi for seeing the decision by then. This is clearly saying, okay, 82%, we see it before the end of March. And this is more like, well, you're probably going to see it either towards the end of February, first week of March, or I don't know, sometime after March, sometime after March 13th. There's no specific range there, and March is just, it could be April, it could be May. These guys would technically be right, okay? Let's try and sum it all up. What we know so far is that on February 23rd, the Supreme Court exits their recess. And when they exit their recess, sometime in the morning, Eastern time, between 9:40 to 10 a.m., they can potentially release decisions on argument days. And that's the end of February, Monday through Wednesday, the 23rd, 24th, 25th, the beginning of March, Monday through Wednesday, first week of March. And then there's another 2-week recess in the middle of March. And then they have another Monday through Wednesday session towards the end of March for 2 more weeks where we can see the decision. Right now, the odds are 80% that we see the decision before the end of March. And it's about 50% odds that we see the decision occur before they go on that next recess in the middle of March. The next bit of information, now that we know what kind of time period we're expecting, is what decision can they possibly make? Right now, we've seen that the Polymarket odds and the Metaculus odds are super against Trump right now. The odds across the board on Metaculus, on Kalshi, on Polymarket are essentially only 20 to 30% odds that the U.S. Supreme Court will rule in favor of Trump's tariffs. And then there's a bunch of people saying, what about a mixed ruling? They might not necessarily declare it lawful, but they might say, we need to make an adjustment here rather than make it outright unlawful. Who knows? This is exemplifying the uncertainty a lot of people have about what the Supreme Court could say and do about the decision. So let's continue on. I originally stated I'm actually in this 20% that the tariffs will be found lawful, or at least in this mixed ruling where the bias is towards the lawful side. This post covers a lot of the consequences of what would happen if the Supreme Court ruled against and overruled and declared that the tariffs Trump put on were illegal. So first, refunds are the big risk. Tariffs already collected may have to be returned to importers. That removes cash from the system and worsens government finances for the United States. Second, the deficit. These tariffs were projected to reduce the U.S. deficit by nearly $3 trillion over the next decade. If the ruling goes against Trump's tariffs, that reduction disappears, and that could hurt the credit rating of the United States. A ruling against Trump does not mean tariffs are permanently banned. It only blocks the current legal structure being used. And we'll go over this part specifically later as well. The president still has other legal tools to impose tariffs, but they are slower, more limited, and less efficient than the current setup. This creates near-term uncertainty. Trump has repeatedly argued that tariffs are supporting economic strength and the stock market. If the court rules against the tariffs, that will be affected badly. Over time, removing tariffs would reduce government revenue, ease inflation pressure, and increase the likelihood of rate cuts. Here's a good counterpoint that I found that was actually just posted in the last 24 hours as I was doing research for this. I found in the Ted Cruz podcast, The Verdict, that he was making a prediction. I was very, very happy to hear as I was doing research to find this. And he actually predicts that there's going to be a vote in favor of Trump's tariff policy of 5-4. Cruz actually did give nice summaries of his prediction, so I'm going to pull up a clip, and it's only a minute long. You know, the Polymarket, the Kalshi, the Metaculus guys, they all are saying, hey, there's like 80% chance that we either get some kind of mixed ruling or the tariffs are just outright declared illegal. Well, we want to try and listen to the people who are in that 20%. I would consider myself in there. I don't want to see the Supreme Court overrule these tariffs because it would create a lot of massive volatility. It wouldn't be good for the United States economically and reputationally. Considering we've listened to everyone else say that these tariffs are over, right? Let's see what the rationale is of someone who is betting against the 80% odds of all the prediction markets.
And I'm going to make a prediction. My prediction right now is the U.S. Supreme Court is going to uphold President Trump's imposition of tariffs. I'm going to further predict that the Supreme Court is going to uphold it by a vote of 5-4, that it is going to be close. And I'm going to break it down in a moment, but what I will say, if this case had been decided a year ago, if it had been decided at the outset of the president's term, I think the court would have ruled that Trump cannot impose these tariffs.
Yeah.
If it were addressing the legal issue in the abstract.
Before all the tariffs got put on.
Here's why I believe the court is going to allow the tariffs to stay in place, and it's a basic principle of reliance. We've had $133 billion in tariffs imposed already and collected. It has been central to President Trump's foreign policy, and the court institutionally is very reluctant to do something that dramatically upsets the status quo. So a year ago, I think the court probably would have ruled differently, but I think today you're going to get 5 justices to say we're too far down the road, too much has been implemented, and this is too core to how this president is implementing foreign policy, because foreign policy under the Constitution is given principally to the president. So that's my prediction, is 5-4, the court is going to uphold President Trump's tariff authority.
Okay, that's the first bit. That's the prediction. And I kept listening to the podcast, and then I found another short clip that I wanted to share. The gist is of why Cruz thinks the court will rule in favor of Trump's tariffs is explicitly because of the exact same risks I actually pointed out at the very beginning of this segment, that it would be a massive upset to the U.S. economy, and it would hurt the U.S. materially if they rocked the boat and ruled against Trump's tariffs. Now that the tariffs have been enacted and used for so long as a very vital instrument of foreign policy. So if they did want to alter Trump's presidential power on tariffs, maybe they rein it back a bit and then they grandfather in everything that's happened so far. That could be an option. There's one more clip where he gave a short summary of the other tariff policies Trump could use to impose tariffs with in the case where the United States Supreme Court overrules Trump's tariffs and says they're unconstitutional, they're illegal. You can't use IEEPA tariffs for this purpose. Let's go ahead and listen to what he has to say here.
If the decision goes the wrong way from the Trump administration, if they strike down the tariffs, it's not the end of the day, because there are other avenues to impose tariffs. So there are three in particular. Number one, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which authorizes tariffs to enforce U.S. rights under trade agreements or to counter unfair foreign practices. The second way the president could try to impose these tariffs again is under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which allows tariffs on imports threatening national security, which was the vehicle Trump used for steel and aluminum tariffs. And the third is under Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974, which permits temporary, quote, safeguard tariffs to protect domestic industries from serious injury caused by import surges. So there are three other statutory bases that the president could go to. If the Supreme Court rules against him, I think the president will go to use those. So you could end up at the same result, but at the end of the day, I'm going back to my prediction, 5-4, the Trump administration prevails.
Okay, so that's everything as far as kind of cursory research. Now I want to wrap it back to that RBC monthly forecast update that we got. This is just the highlights that I want to focus on for this analysis here that we're going to be doing next, okay? So first off, they start with saying uncertainty surrounding U.S. protectionist trade policy lingers, and the lagged effect of tariffs are still very much in play. An imminent U.S. Supreme Court ruling on the legal status of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA tariffs, remain a key source of volatility to our forecast. As we seek clarity on tariff pass-through with reduced data visibility to core goods inflation that's still expected to rise in Q2. In Canada, we expect fewer implications for the IEEPA ruling as long as crucial tariff exemptions tied to CUSMA compliant trade are preserved. So CUSMA or USMCA is the replacement for NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that allows for lower trade barriers and privileged trade between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Trade exposed manufacturing sectors continue to underperform in Canada, but spillover to the rest of the economy remains limited. Non-IEEPA measures that account for about half of U.S. tariffs will remain unaffected by the upcoming court decision. By our count, 88% of Canadian exports to the United States in November were not charged with tariffs, likely because they were compliant under the rules of the CUSMA. That leaves IEEPA measures really only effective on less than 5% of exports from Canada to the United States. In November, Canada faced an average effective U.S. tariff rate of 3.7%, the lowest of all major U.S. trade partners. Canada has the lowest tariff rate of all U.S. trade partners. Still potentially for changes remain key to our baseline forecast. Canada may lose competitive advantage globally, but could see increased U.S. demand if IEEPA tariffs are struck down and not replaced. Other countries could see significant tariff reductions, and Canada could lose status as the lowest tariffed U.S. trade partner. On the flip side, U.S. tariffs will be halved, leading to increases in U.S. industrial activities and foreign demand. Indeed, we continue to view Canada's international trade risk as a function of 1, Canada's competitive position in the U.S. import market, and 2, broader overall resilience in U.S. import demand tied to the severity of tariffs. Those two are balancing the impact of the IEEPA ruling on Canada's economy. And then we get a very helpful chart here, if I can zoom in real quick. Canada's less exposed to IEEPA than other U.S. trade partners. So this is why the U.S. Supreme Court ruling is important. Let's go ahead and kind of take it from the top. The U.S. Supreme Court on February 23rd is going to make a decision about whether or not all these blue bars here, the IEEPA tariffs, are legal And if they are overturned by the Supreme Court, the United States will no longer have these tariffs in effect. That means it's going to benefit China, it's going to benefit India, it's going to benefit Japan, it's going to benefit South Korea, it's going to help the Euro area, it's going to help the UK, it's going to kind of help Mexico. And then you can see Canada right here, this tiny little itsy bitsy little blue sliver. So if we're looking for trades potentially in favor of a decision where the tariffs, the IEEPA tariffs, are overturned, then we need to look at assets in these economies that are going to benefit the most from these tariffs being overturned. So that's China, India, Japan, South Korea, Euro, ROW, UK. Somewhat Mexico, somewhat Canada, but it's mostly these other countries. Now we have the three important things to making a trade plan. When could this occur? We went ahead and did all that. We know it's probably end of February, beginning of March, or end of March. 50% odds that it's in February, beginning of March, and then rest of the odds, about 80% chance that we see it at the end of March. And then we want to know, okay, what are the odds that the decision is actually made? It's probably 80-20, 70-30 in favor of an overruling of the tariffs currently. But if you listen to a few experts, there's some pretty strong people in the category that these tariffs will stand because of how much potential damage could occur to the U.S. economy if these IEEPA, of all these blue bars here, were ripped out and thrown away and potentially forced to be repaid. That would be a really bad scenario. So there's degrees to the decision that also need to be accounted for when the decision actually occurs. And then the last part is what assets to look at. You can't just look at every single asset. There's going to be some assets that are impacted more significantly than others. Well, now that we know which countries are most exposed to the IEEPA tariffs, we also know, okay, maybe their national equity markets, their currencies, their debt markets, their bond markets, their commodities that are exported from these countries are all on the table. We can start looking at charts and start making trade plans, but I think it's pretty straightforward. It's going to be very likely dollar bearish in that scenario. So we have dollar CAD. It'll probably move, but not by much, as we just read in that report. What we really want to look at is probably Great British Pound, Euro, Yen, Yuan, Korean Won, and Rupee. I really wish Switzerland was here because Trump's been talking recently about how he increased the tariffs on Switzerland after having a bad experience with their leader. Let's go ahead and look at Great British Pound, US dollar. So this would be up. This is when recess ends. Pretty good chance that we see something happen around here towards end of month. Some really crazy volatility. So we could probably end up past this prior high here. So given the current price, I'd say just 140. 140. If they just totally overrule it and demand refunds, pound goes to 140. That would be a huge move. Maybe something more conservative would be like a 1 or 200 pip move. If we go and check out Euro dollar, and I am currently long this going into the Supreme Court recess. Now, here's the other thing. This is kind of, in my opinion, an asymmetric setup because if they do rule against the tariffs, it's probably going to weaken the dollar, at least as the initial snap reaction, reflexive reaction. As George Soros would put it, the reflexive reaction would be probably dollar weak, would be my baseline assumption. And if they do keep the tariffs enforced, the dollar already is supposed to be weaker due to more stimulatory monetary policy. So expectations continue for what we nominally expect, which is a weaker dollar, but kind of at a more gradual trend instead of in the situation where we have the Supreme Court rule that the tariffs are illegal, a massive jump, right?